Exile, a strange and painful word, which somehow we feel can never possibly be applied to us. Leave home and country and all that is dear and near, that surely is something that could not possibly happen to me. I thought so too. And yet I was to learn what exile meant. There are many exiles. Some of them we take upon ourselves. We choose to exile ourselves by the choice which we make. We choose to behave differently from other people. We choose to behave against the laws of the church. We find ourselves exiles by our own choice. A choice which Lucifer made long ago. A choice which, alas, many of us still make. There is that other exile which is because of something you believe in, which you go into voluntarily too, not from those things which are true and pure and holy, but from the worldly things and those things we know are wrong. And we are excluded from that kind of society, and that's a kind of exile too. Or we are taken as were the Israelites of old and taken into bondage. That is the fate of so many today. And as always, if you turn to the Bible, there are all the examples of what humanity has suffered. And I found a passage which rang so true for me when I was thinking about the series of these lectures. Jeremiah says, "Weep not for the dead, neither bemoan him, but weep sore for him that goeth away, for he shall return no more, nor see his native land." Long ago those words were written, and how true they are for so many. And that was written by someone who was in bondage. Just as I was leaving New York to come here, I heard that a very dear friend of mine, a very beautiful woman, had committed suicide in Romania. And I asked, but why? Well, they said, both her husband and her son had been deported to Russia. And she could not face the loneliness of remaining in her own land when those she loved had been taken away. Of course, that is not the way out, but it's an understandable thing. It is terrible to be separated from those you love. When this fate befell me, God was gracious to me, and I was able to take my children with me. That worst and most terrible of separations didn't happen to me. Still, I was parted from another part of my life, which meant, in its way, just as much as my children mean to me. We were brought up to understand that there was a larger family than those who were our kin by blood. That kinship which united us in one country, that made us one people and one family. So that in a way I know what it means to be parted from those that mean just as much as my lawful family, to call it that way. And I know what it feels like, and it is very like what we imagine death to be. It is much worse than death, really, because it severs your life entirely. There is something that comes to a definite end. And you have to go on with half your life disappeared. And yet you go on living. Everything that you have known has gone. Everything that you have worked for has gone. And this punishment comes to you not for something that you have done wrong, but for the right that you have done. And you have to face that evil seems to be stronger. I've often wondered if you have time before you die, if you would look round that same way as I did when I left and thought to myself, this I shall see no more. This is an end, and this, and this, and you touch things and you talk to people and you say goodbye, but you have not the relief of parting with your body as well. You have to take that with you. And that's what is so terribly difficult, is to take yourself along. You cannot part from that. Although there are few people you can turn round to and say, do you remember? You do go on remembering. And although there are no more anybody who shares your thoughts and your longings and your aspirations and your hopes, you still go on hoping and having aspirations. And you find yourself amongst new people and new ideas, and they are strangers to you, and you are a stranger to them. And it's very difficult in a moment like that not to be lost. Because there's another strange thing about exile. It is also that having lost those reasons for which you had worked, and those laws and regulations which belong to that society and country to which you had belonged, are no more there. Something of the stamina, something of that which kept you straight in spite of yourself in the old days, is no more. You have to learn the ways of other people. And that is a great moment of danger. And that's a great moment of danger which I think faces anybody. You don't necessarily have to go through the sort of experience I went through. I think all of us know that feeling of being shut out. I know as a child how dreadfully unhappy I could be when my brothers and sisters who were older than me would play a part and say, you are small, get out of the way, we don't want you here. How alone and lost I felt and how angry I was. And because they wouldn't let me play their game, I wouldn't play mine either. I wanted to do something bad and destroy things, spoil their game for them, because they wouldn't let me play it with them. When we are grown up that happens to us too. Sometimes the society of somebody we are very fond of, a group of people we have felt very at one with, will suddenly exclude you. Perhaps for good reasons, perhaps justly, maybe unjustly. But you are excluded just the same. And you hear them making plans in which you are not included. And you feel terribly alone. You're shut out. There's something else that sometimes shuts us out, and that is the pain of someone else. It's so awfully hard to get near to someone who's suffering. Be it mental or physical suffering, it somehow puts a barrier between you who are not suffering and the one that is. And you realize again how terribly alone a human being is, even when he is surrounded by those who love him most. And that's a loneliness both sides feel. And that too is a form of exile, and something that hurts us deeply. And that is the moment when we usually fall. We would fall if there was not something else, something very real. So sometimes we forget about it. Yet not quite. Because all of us, in a way or other, we are always conscious of God's presence. We often try to ignore it. We forget about it. And yet in that moment of loneliness, in that moment when you are separated by something from everybody else, you'd like to put your hand out in the dark. And you do instinctively do so. When you are walking through the dark and you come upon a sudden hole or a staircase and you tumble, you put your hand out. Spiritually, we do the same. And that is what I discovered in my own exile. That in the moment when things were worst and hardest and darkest, I suddenly put my hand out. I suddenly cried, God have mercy upon me. Mercy. Suddenly that word had meaning for me. It wasn't so much that I wanted help. It wasn't so much that I wanted to be dragged out of it. But I wanted to feel that somebody had mercy. Mercy for that torture and pain that was in the very depth, in the very middle of my heart. And blindly, as one in the dark, I saw and I found that that mercy was very near. At first I couldn't quite understand, because the situation continued to be terrible. Because for people like we were at that moment when we got out from under the communist oppression, who had lived for 4 years under them, there were two things that separated us from the rest of the world. One was our own suffering, which the others couldn't understand, the mentality which we had got, and the suspiciousness of other people. Why had we stood 4 years of it? Why had we got out so late? Why had one known so-and-so? And then you see that You just don't speak the same language with the others. Also, you have to learn to live in the free world again. And all that is painful and difficult. And although you feel that God's mercy is near you, still you cannot understand, nor do you know exactly how to help yourself. That process of dying and learning to live once more takes a very long time. But I who have passed through it can only tell you that it doesn't matter really. That time really is full of blessing. It is just a time when we are obliged to go through the desert. And as we read in the Bible the story of Hagar, when she was thrown out with her son, and after they had wandered many days through the desert, they had no more water. And she sat by her dying child, and at last she prayed. And then the Lord opened her eyes, and she saw that the water was there in a well quite nearby. If she hadn't gone through the desert, if she hadn't gone through that time of despair, her eyes may never have been opened to that well. And that's what happened to me too. Suddenly I knew that that well was there. It was only myself that had closed my eyes. I had chosen to take my suffering personally. I had chosen myself the dark side of the picture. And yet it is strange. One has to go through that time of darkness so as to appreciate light. And I saw how wonderful are the ways of the Lord. And there was another verse that helped me so much at that time. We must needs die and are as water spilt upon the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Neither doth God respect any person, yet doth he devise means that his banished be not expelled from him. So I knew somehow that God would gather us up. All those of us who were spread far and wide, just as water is spilled upon the ground. And somehow that gave me courage, because in the situation in which we found ourselves, there was also something of being a coward about it, which is also not easy to face. I felt that those who had remained behind were so much braver. They had remained there to face the impossible, and were facing it. And they did not let despair get hold of their hearts. They fought against it. We had the example of old and young. We had the example of our soldiers who, taken away from their own country and home, were as prisoners, and offered the choice of coming back at the price of selling their souls, chose to remain there. 180,000 of them never returned. Not because they could not, but because they would not. There were those who chose exile for the glory of God. We always think of the first Christian martyrs as something belonging definitely to the past. That is not true. The Christian martyrs are there today, and many more of them than there were at the beginning. Of course, we may also say there are very many more Christians now than there were then. That is true also. But I think that almost the tortures to which the Christians are exposed today are very much more terrible than those in the first centuries. Because remember, these people haven't got the glory of dying in public. They have no way of openly showing the strength of their faith. They haven't got the honor of standing up and saying, I die for my God, and let others see them do it. But they die miserably in prisons, in camps, on fields, in woods. It is almost impossible for us, as we stand here tonight in the peace of this beautiful church, to think of those who never come anywhere near a church, for whom the church doors are closed. Yes, in chains they work and slave, just because they will not say yes to something which they know is wrong. On a last map of Romania which I saw the other day, a sad map to look at, the 10th of May is Romania's Independence Day. It didn't last very long, that independence of ours. But the idea of it has always been in our hearts and still is. Well, for that day now, a map was made. And instead of marking upon it industries and beautiful places to visit, on it were shown all the places where people are suffering. Concentration camps, slave labor camps, prisons, detention houses. 10,000 dead, only of those who work on a canal between the Black Sea and the Danube. One wonders if when the world is free once more, how are we going to make good the death of so many people? What will be our feelings if our ships go down that canal and we get rich? How many of us will remember those who died? Died for no other reason than simply that they were faithful. Faithful to an idea. Why I think of this is that this is not the first time that such things have happened in history. We know the pyramids were built that way, and yet today we admire them. We know that Moscow and St. Petersburg were built that way, and yet we look at Peter the Great as something rather wonderful. We call him Peter the Great, yet he built his city with the lives of men. It seems so horrible. And yet I have an idea that it isn't. The horrible part is those who do it, and worse still, those who forget. For we have no right to forget. The lives of those who lived for their idea of freedom and of God. You must imagine what it must mean not to commit suicide when you are faced by such a thing. And the wonderful part of it is that they don't commit suicide, that they go on. I will not say that I think that all of them are deeply spiritual people, or that the Christian idea is perfectly clear to them. But I think we forget something else, and that is that our whole society is built upon our faith in God. I think that no one, if he looks back, can remember a time when God was not consciously in his life. If we look backwards into our childhood, we certainly do not remember a time when we were alone, when other people were not around us. And if we delve further back into those memories, we will remember Christmas Day, Sunday, Easter, the holidays. They're all centered around something that has to do with God. All modern life is built on it. Even the communists haven't been able to get rid of Sunday. I remember as a child reading a very beautiful poem, and it ended that if nothing else would bring man back to God, the need of rest will. And so we realize that even the worst of people, even those who have denied God entirely, that are trying to create a new world in which there is no God, they still have had to have a day of rest. They still abide by God's law. They cannot help it. There was a time when they tried to make the day of rest every 10th day, so as not to have a Sunday, because Sunday so absolutely belongs in man's mind attached to God, and they were not able to do it. There's a deeper law in that 7th day of rest than we generally realize. Exactly what it is, I suppose nobody could explain, except to understand that it is God's day, and that if we will not in another way return to Him, in fatigue, we do. As tired children, we turn back to Him and seek our rest. And then we see something else, that is a bond between us all, even amongst the faithful and the unfaithful. That is one day we all accept. And we see how wonderfully God works through the darkest hours, through the darkest minds, the worst times of history. Did it strike you as strange that when Stalin died, the Russian people prayed for him? This man who had denied God and church was being prayed for in the end. What a triumph for Christianity. He could not stamp it out, and that superstition in which he did not believe was working at the hour of his death. And there's nothing strange nor wrong in a Christian people praying for a man who was wicked at the hour of his death. It's what we were always meant to do. And I couldn't help putting that together with comparing it to a remark I heard from someone here who had never known what it didn't mean to have freedom, who hadn't known any persecution at all. I happened to telephone to this person, and he said to me, "Oh, we've just been rejoicing." And I said, "Well, over what?" He told me over Stalin's death. But the people in Russia were praying for their oppressor. And somehow I feel that the people who still can do that, which ordinarily the free world no more knows how to do, are rather wonderful. And then you come to see something else. That we measure things by their success. But we are not right to do that. If you look at it that way, our Lord's life was certainly not a success. We forget, you know, that to be crucified in those days was just as bad as it is today to be hung. We forget that when our Lord said, "Take up your cross and follow me," the cross had no glamour. It hadn't the dignified position we have given to it today. In those days it was a sign of shame. And I often feel that we pass that by too easily. I know when it first struck me, was really in a critical sense, because I said to myself, why did he say that? It mustn't be true, because he said that before he was crucified. So what sense did it have? It didn't then have the sense that it has today. It doesn't only mean noble suffering. It also means supporting the ridicule, supporting not being a success, supporting being different from other people. It means those who are ready to die quietly and unnoticed for something that they believe in, for something which they think is worthwhile. And hundreds are doing that today. Hundreds of them. Hundreds of them are working over the world with nowhere to go to. I read a bitter little poem written by one of the Romanian poets in exile, And he says 2 letters on a scrap of paper, thousands of lives in a monogram. That's exactly what DP is. Thousands of lives in a monogram. It is the cross of our generation. And there are many who are bearing it. But somehow I feel that we too are responsible towards them. We cannot ignore them. We cannot say, am I my brother's keeper? And just shrug. We are our brother's keeper. Especially if we call ourselves Christians. Our duty is not done by simply going to church. It's the way we go there and the prayers that are in our hearts. Both of gratitude and of love and understanding for those people whose lives are not a success. Not necessarily only for those who are behind the Iron Curtain, or those who find themselves in camps for refugees, but even amongst ourselves. How many are there whom we exclude from our society because they're not just like ourselves, because so-and-so has managed to make a success of his life, therefore let's look down on him. So-and-so isn't of the same color as myself. So-and-so doesn't dress like I do, doesn't keep his house in such and such a way, doesn't bring up his children like I would do it. He's different. I exclude him. Why should we exclude them? Why should we force people into exile whom we could receive? You know, one gets to know that there is a great blessing in sorrow and in despair. Slowly, we come to realize that unless we pass through those hours of darkness, unless we cross the desert, we do not know how to appreciate light, nor do we know how to rejoice over a glass of cold water. Those are symbols. But they are great blessings too. Only one who's been really thirsty and hungry knows what I'm talking about. But our Lord said, you only give a glass of water in my name. But do we do it in his name? That is the point. I feel that many things would be different if we really would do it for the love of our Lord, for the love of God. Because then we'd make no more difference between lands and nations and races and faiths. Because we're no more doing it just to be kind to so-and-so, because we pity them, but because we love God. And then we'd be ready to meet any trial, to face any difficulty, because we have learned to outgrow something that suffering is making us learn. Even we are outgrowing our selfish love of country and understanding simply to love man. And I'd like to finish this evening with a few words which I have found and which have been very deep, have great and deep meaning for me, because they are so extraordinarily true. I bless thee, Lord, above all, for those evil days which thou hast let me see.